You're standing in a marble hall in Alexandria, Egypt, in the year 48 BCE. Scrolls line the walls floor to ceiling. Hundreds of thousands of them. Maybe 500,000. Somewhere in this room is the only copy of a lost play by Sophocles. Somewhere else, a star chart that won't be matched in accuracy for another 1,500 years. You can smell the papyrus and the oil lamps. And outside, you can smell smoke. Within a few hours, some of what you're standing in will be gone. Not all of it. Not yet. But the story you've been told about that day is mostly wrong. And the real story is stranger, slower, and far more disturbing than a single fire. So what actually happened to the Library of Alexandria? And why does almost nobody know the real answer? Let's start with what the library actually was. It wasn't really a library in the way you're picturing. It was closer to a research institute. The Greeks called it the Mouseon, a shrine to the Muses, the goddesses of knowledge and art. Founded around 295 BCE under Ptolemy I, a general who had inherited a piece of Alexander the Great's empire, the Mouseon was part university, part royal archive, part obsession. The Ptolemies wanted everything. Every scroll, every text, every piece of knowledge that existed anywhere in the known world. Ships docking in Alexandria's harbour were searched, and any books found on board were confiscated, copied, and only sometimes returned. The copies stayed. The originals often didn't. Scholars were paid salaries to live inside the complex and do nothing but think, translate, and write. It was, by some estimates, the closest the ancient world ever came to a government-funded research lab. And it worked. Euclid wrote the foundations of geometry here. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth here, using nothing but shadows and a well, and got it almost exactly right. Herophilus performed some of the first recorded human dissections here, mapping the nervous system over 1,000 years before European medicine would attempt the same thing. This is the part most people never learn. The library wasn't just a building. It was a 300-year head start on the rest of human history. And that's exactly why its disappearance matters so much. Consider what was actually inside those walls. Historians estimate the collection at its peak held somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls. To put that in perspective, that's roughly equivalent to every book ever written up to that point in the ancient Mediterranean world, gathered under one roof. The astronomer Aristarchus of Samos worked here too, and centuries before Copernicus, he proposed that the Earth orbited the Sunday. The idea was largely ignored in his own time. But the fact that it existed at all, written down, debated, preserved on a shelf in Alexandria, tells you something about how far ahead this institution really was. Now, the story you probably know goes like this. Julius Caesar invades Alexandria in 48 BCE, sets fire to the harbour to stop an enemy fleet. The fire spreads, and the greatest library in the ancient world burns to the ground in one catastrophic night. Clean. Dramatic. Easy to remember. It's also almost certainly not what happened. Or at least, not the whole truth. Here's the first problem. The ancient sources that mention the fire don't agree on what burned. The Roman writer Plutarch mentions a fire near the docks during Caesar's siege, but he never says the library itself was destroyed. Other ancient historians, writing decades or even centuries later, describe the fire differently each time, and some don't mention it at all. Strabo, a geographer who visited Alexandria roughly 20 years after Caesar's siege, describes the Mouseon as still functioning, still full of scholars, still operating like nothing catastrophic had happened to it. So, if the Great Library burned to the ground in 48 BCE, why was a respected geographer casually describing it as alive and well 2 decades later? There's a deeper problem too. The historian Cassius Dio, writing over 2 centuries after the event, mentions a fire that destroyed warehouses near the harbour, full of grain and books awaiting shipment. He doesn't call it the library. He calls it a storehouse. Somewhere between Dio's account and the way the story gets retold today, a burning warehouse on the docks quietly became the destruction of the single greatest collection of knowledge in the ancient world. That's not a small distortion. That's an entire institution disappearing inside a sentence that was never actually written. The answer is that the library didn't die in a single night. It died slowly, over centuries, through a combination of disasters that historians have only recently started piecing back together properly. The first blow was likely Caesar's fire, but probably a partial one. Ancient Alexandria had multiple library buildings, including a secondary collection at a temple called the Serapeum. The fire near the docks in 48 BCE may have destroyed warehouses storing scrolls intended for export, not the main collection itself. A fire. A real loss. But not the end. The second blow came almost 300 years later. In 270 CE, the Roman Emperor Aurelian fought to retake Alexandria from a breakaway empire, and the fighting devastated the royal quarter of the city, the district where the original Mausion stood. By most modern historical reconstructions, this is where the core of Ptolemy's original library most likely met its true end. Not symbolism. Urban warfare. The third blow is the one almost nobody talks about, and it might be the most important. In 391 CE, the Roman Emperor Theodosius issued a decree banning pagan religious practices across the empire. In Alexandria, this triggered the destruction of the Serapeum, the temple that housed the daughter library, the secondary collection that had survived everything up to that point. Christian sources describe the destruction as a triumph over idolatry. What they don't dwell on is what else was inside that temple when it fell. And then there's the fourth blow, smaller, quieter, but relentless. Scrolls made of papyrus simply don't last forever. Without constant, expensive recopying by trained scribes, papyrus degrades within a few hundred years. Funding for that kind of maintenance had been drying up for generations before any of the fires or riots. Some historians now argue that neglect, not violence, may have done more damage than any single dramatic event. There's a fifth thread worth pulling on too, and it isn't about scrolls at all. It's about what happens to a culture of knowledge once the institutions protecting it start to crumble. A generation after the Serapeum fell, the mathematician and philosopher Hypatia, one of the last great scholars associated with Alexandria's intellectual tradition, was murdered by a mob in the city's streets. She taught astronomy. She edited mathematical texts. And her death, in 415 CE, is often treated by historians as a symbolic final period at the end of the sentence that began with Ptolemy's scholars 3.5 centuries earlier. Not because she worked inside the original Mausion. She didn't. But because her death marked the moment Alexandria stopped being a place where that kind of open inquiry could safely happen at all. So which theory is correct? Caesar's fire? Aurelian's war? Theodosius's purge? Or just slow decay? The honest answer is probably all four, layered on top of each other across 400 years. But that raises a much harder question. If it wasn't one dramatic act of destruction, why does almost everyone still believe it was? Here's the twist. The simple version of the story, one villain, one fire, one tragic night, isn't an accident. It's useful. Roman writers loyal to Caesar had reasons to downplay his role in any fire. Christian writers centuries later had reasons to downplay the destruction of the Serapeum, since it happened at the hands of their own emperor and their own religious movement. Each era's storytellers quietly shaped the narrative to protect whoever they didn't want blamed. In other words, the library wasn't just destroyed by people. It was edited by people, again and again, long after the scrolls themselves were gone. And that's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. We talk about the Library of Alexandria as the ultimate symbol of lost knowledge. But what actually disappeared wasn't just papyrus and ink. It was the true sequence of events, deliberately blurred across centuries by writers with their own reputations to protect. Think about how much of what you know about history works the same way. Not invented. Not exactly false. Just simplified, smoothed over, and quietly shaped by whoever told the story last. Modern researchers, including classicist Roger Bagnall, have spent years trying to reconstruct what was actually lost, cross-referencing ancient catalogues, surviving citations, and archaeological remains at the Alexandria site. Their conclusion isn't a single dramatic moment. It's a long, uneven unraveling, one almost too undramatic to make a good legend, which may be exactly why the simpler story won. So here's the modern echo. We still do this. Every major event today gets compressed into a single clean narrative within days, sometimes hours, long before the full picture is even available. One cause. One villain. One night. It's not because that's what happened. It's because that's what's easiest to remember, easiest to repeat, and easiest for someone to control. The Library of Alexandria didn't just lose its scrolls. It lost its own story to the very same forces that destroyed it. told and retold by people who each had a reason to leave something out. You're standing in a marble hall in Alexandria that doesn't exist anymore, in a city that built over it centuries ago. And the fire you can smell isn't really the reason it's gone. The real reason is quieter, slower, and still happening every single time a complicated truth gets reduced to a simple story, because the simple story is the one that survives.